Hello everyone, we are back with another video for Janus Academy. This is the introduction to the course that we're going to be calling Historical Analogies, or short analogies. The goal of this course is for us to shed a light into a very important historical phenomenon that we are very curious for, that we are very interested in, and that has a lot to do with how history of art happens, with how history of art progresses. You could argue that this is not something that is generally related to history of art, that this is a more general tendency, that it has a lot to do with politics, it has a lot to do with culture in general, it has a lot to do with, broadly speaking, history of ideas. And this is why it is so important. So you could say that the tendency we are going to talk about here today and that we're going to develop an entire course around is the tendency that we want to go back to history. We want to go back to eras that no longer exist, to eras that previously happened. And we have observed, not only us, I mean, this is a broadly common knowledge, that certain eras in history of art, in general, history of humanity, history of ideas, tend to communicate, that they tend to evoke one another. And generally speaking, of course, this means that certain eras invoke eras that happened before them. So what we want to do is we want to give our unique perspective at this, and we want to compare certain periods that happened, some that are closer to us and some that are further away from us. When I say us, I'm talking about contemporary moment. This is now February of 2025 when we are recording this. So we're talking about, broadly speaking, postmodern times, and we're going to be addressing periods that came before us and periods that came way before us. We're going to go to the distant past and we're going to go to the recent past. And some of these talks will also be around our current contemporary era, which is our present. So I think the best way to start is to give the very broadly, commonly known example of the relation between the Renaissance period and the classical Greece. So when we say classical Greece, we are referring to the period of the 5th and the 4th century BCE. And when we say the Renaissance, we are referring to, broadly speaking, Italy in the 15th century. Now, there are a lot of talks on when the Renaissance exactly began. I think it began before the 15th century. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this talk. Generally speaking, the way I was taught this in school, when I studied in high school and university, we were taught that the Renaissance officially began with the fall of Constantinople, which was 1453. Again, I think Renaissance began way earlier. You could argue with paintings of Giotto, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that the whole focus of the Renaissance was on classical antiquity, that the reason why this entire period was known as the Renaissance was because it was trying to invoke, it was trying to bring back and really bring together something that was no longer there. And this something is the heritage, aesthetics, set of ideas, mores, worldviews, if you will, of the classical antiquity. Now, if you think about this, there's a considerable period of time spanning between the 5th century BCE and 15th century CE. There is really almost 2,000 years in between the two. 2,000 years is a lot of time by any standards. Even if you come from ancient civilizations, even if you come from a relatively modern country, 2,000 years is a lot of time. So why would these people in Renaissance Italy, let's say in the city of Florence, that was one of the hotbeds of the Renaissance, try to reimagine themselves as classical Greeks, or to a certain extent as Romans, because this was also a very important and very present tendency in Renaissance Italy. So they had a reason to go back to this particular age. We're going to be addressing this as we go. For the moment, we want to underline and we want to turn our attention to the existence of this tendency that is, on surface at least, counterintuitive to how we see things. We tend to see things as linearly developing. So if we are looking at things from the Christian point of view or Abrahamic point of view, broadly speaking, we are talking about the linear development of time. And this is a very different thing than how the pagans were observing time, because for pagans, time was cyclical. It always went back to its point of origin. So pagans observed time as a cyclical affair, much like they observe the seasons of the year. So you know that when you're observing the seasons, you have spring, you have summer, fall, winter, and then you have spring again. So let's say that if you are to take an even smaller example, if you're observing the cycle of the day, you have morning, then you have noon, then you have the evening, then you have night, and then tomorrow you have morning again. So nature tends to work in cycles. And you could say that the great advance, the great innovation of Christianity and, broadly speaking, Abrahamic religions was this notion that time is linear and that we are progressing. The pagan people did not necessarily believe in progress quite as much as we are supposed to. So if we are to assume this notion that with our religion, with our existence, with, let's say, development of technology, we can clearly observe linearity of our progress. We can clearly observe that we are advancing, so to say. This is a very loaded statement, not to get into it, if we are advancing or we are descending. But yes, the time is, let's say, linear in this particular worldview. So why are then we compelled to constantly go back to what already happened and to constantly bring back what belongs to the past? To constantly reenact, rehash, and revive the past. If we are to go back to the example of the Renaissance, truly the whole idea of the Renaissance is that of revival. So it's the meaning of the term, indeed. Revival is how we translate Renaissance from French or Rinascimento from Italian. So yeah, if we're talking about this particular dynamic between the Renaissance and the classical Greece, I think we can have an example, a very famous one and a very beautiful example, incredibly well-made painting, a fresco rather, of Raffaello di Santi. This is the School of Athens fresco you can find in Vatican. Monumentally a large work of art, very complex, very layered, exquisitely well done. Personally, I had the opportunity to see the drawing, the preparatory drawing for this painting in Milan, and it's even better than the painting itself. So this drawing is truly out of this world. Not to get into all of that, the whole idea is that we have a Renaissance painter that arguably is the very peak of that period, go back and paint in the heart of Catholic Christianity, if you will, Vatican, paint a scene from classical Athens, the school of Athens that features most Athenian philosophers present at that time, most notably in the center of the painting, Plato and Aristotle. So why would they do this? Why would people in Vatican who are Catholic, who are Christian, and who are very much decidedly against paganism, go back to the pagan period, revive it, rehash it, and really feel that is so important that they would basically ornate one of the papal stanzas with this? You could argue the same thing about another great painting by Raphael, another fresco that's called Triumph of Galatea, one of my personal favorite Raphael paintings and paintings in general. This is also to be found in the Vatican. So why do we do this? We're going to try to unravel, and we're going to try to use this course to answer this very, very complex question. Why do we go back to the past? And we're going to be taking certain time periods, and we're going to be comparing them to certain other time periods. Now, I want to take another example that is a bit closer to us time-wise. Chronologically speaking, the example is from modern day America, United States of America. So if you go to, let's say, the New York City, you can see that it's nicknamed Gotham. Not only in the famous comic book Batman, where we have Gotham City, but also New York City itself. You can see that it has a lot of streets that are dedicated to Gotham. You can see the company that's called Gotham Real Estate. It's all over the place. It's basically Gotham. And the reason why we call New York Gotham, why it has this nickname, one of the reasons at least, is that it has a lot of Gothic revival architecture. So all of New York is built in this particular style, or most of it. You could argue that the thing we associate to New York the most are skyscrapers. It has a lot of those. And every skyscraper in its essence is Gothic revival. We're going to go back to this in a minute. We can say that we have a lot of Art Deco skyscrapers there. Art Deco as a style is Gothic revival. It comes out of Gothic revival. It's a branch of this particular style. So we can ask ourselves, okay, this is the skyscrapers, but what about all the other buildings, like let's say Cathedral of St. Peter, that is fully Gothic revival? It's not an adaptation, it's not a branch, it really is a church that was made to look Gothic, and that we know was not made in the medieval period. It was not made in the 12th to the 13th to the 14th century when Gothic style was around, all up until the 16th century. Why would they go about making an entire church, a very beautiful one, in the city of New York, in the New World, in the United States of America, in a style that is no longer around, in a style that is very decisively connected to the medieval period, so as is the case with Gothic style. So what is the deal with this? Well, we can say that there is a dynamic that we want to address, first of all, between Gothic style that happened in Europe between the 12th and the 16th century, and the Gothic revival style that started happening in England in the second half of the 18th century, but then was exported to the rest of the world, France, most notably United States. So if you ask yourself, why is this the case? Why would they push forward with this style? Why would they have so many buildings, not only skyscrapers and churches, but regular buildings, villas, private homes, etc.? This is a very prevalent style of New York. Why would they go about it? Well, it really has a lot to do with the character of the United States in the 19th century and in early 20th century. So it has to do with the fact that United States of America were formed by settlers. It's a settler colony. The entire country is. And when they came there, they found that this particular continent already had a lot of people that already lived there. These people had their own culture, they had their own language. It's more adequate to say that these peoples, because there were many, had their own cultures and languages. They had many, many different, not to say tribes, but entirely different ethnicities, etc. So there was an already existing presence, human presence in this continent, and these new settlers wanted to bring their own culture. And they were basically building a branch of Europe. It was very important for them to prove to themselves and to the rest of the world that they are still a European culture, that they are Christian, that they are white, and all of these other things that go with it, not to unravel this particular controversial topic, but it was really important for them to underline that connection. And you can better understand the importance of this if you come to Paris, if you go to the Orsay Museum. So you see there's a line of statues in front of the Orsay Museum that represent continents. And every continent is allegorically represented as a woman. And every continent has characteristics, traits, attributes that are attributed to it. Now, this is all, of course, very colonial, very racist, not to get into that. The whole point is that you can turn your attention to the statue that represents North America. We have one statue that represents Europe, one that represents Asia, Africa, Australia, North and South America. So when you look at North America, this statue comes from the second half of the 19th century, all of them do. And this statue is represented as an Indian woman, or rather, as we call them today, a Native American woman. So we can see this in her traits, we can see this in the way she is dressed, in her clothes. So she is represented as Native American, which is entirely different, culture, language, ethnicity, everything, from settler colonialists that came and that created the United States of America. So we can see that even in the late 19th century, when this state was all but established, when it was already the most industrialized country in the world, already a serious economic powerhouse, so still in the popular imagination, this continent was associated with the Indians, the Native Americans, rather than with European settlers. So these people felt uncertain about their own identity. They needed to affirm their own identity. And so they reached further back in the past, European past, which was also their past because they mostly came from Europe, the ones that came there of their own volition, that is. And so they invested themselves wholeheartedly in Gothic revival style. Now, we cannot talk about Gothic style properly because we are talking here about the 19th and the 20th century. There's no Gothic style in those periods. There are Gothic revival styles. And this is a style that is present to this day. We still have Gothic revival architects. We still have Gothic revival buildings being built as we speak. There was a great exhibition in the Pompidou Center in 2023, if I'm not mistaken. It was dedicated to Norman Foster. He is one of those architects that is still around, still active, doing very interesting things. His whole expression is Gothic revival. So it's a contemporary thing to this day. And we can see that in this particular case, we are talking about style. We are talking about a period in history of art, Gothic revival, that has its aesthetics, obviously, but it also has its immense cultural value and its immense political value. So we can see that this style is not just about aesthetics, it's really about political and cultural positioning. People who use Gothic revival style in the United States of America are sending a very important message. They're sending the message that it's far more than just aesthetics for them, that this is the question of belonging. It's belonging to a certain culture, it's belonging to a certain religion too, even it's belonging to a certain race. So we can see that ambition of this particular style, or rather the usage of this style, is very broad. It goes way beyond the context of history of art and what we consider to be the main topic, or one of the main topics of history of art, which is the question of beauty, the question of beauty. So we could argue that one of the greatest examples of what we are talking about is the Chrysler Building, one of my personal favorite buildings in the world. I absolutely love this. This is an architectural masterpiece. It's phenomenally well made. Every time I go to New York, I really make it a point to go and visit and to see it in person. There's not enough praise to be said about how beautiful this building is. Now, obviously, we're talking about the Art Deco building. This is not a controversial information. Everybody knows that Chrysler Building is Art Deco. It belongs to this particular style. But what we want to underline here, what we want to explain a bit further, is that Art Deco truly is a branch of Gothic revival style. So Art Deco does not just happen in vacuum. It grows out of Art Nouveau partially, and it grows partially out of Gothic revival. Art Nouveau in its own right grows out of Gothic revival. So if you look at the Chrysler Building, you can see that it has a steeple, which we can see on Gothic cathedrals. It has a spire. This is a very Gothic thing. It has the general shape of a Gothic cathedral, of the broken arch. And very literally, it has gargoyles. Now, these are not medieval gargoyles that are grotesque dragon-like figures. They're eagles. We know that the bald eagle is an American thing. So we see them positioned as gargoyles. So you can see that even in these details and in the whole of appearance of this building, it is Gothic revival. So you can make a very elaborate analogy then, and we possibly will further down the road in this course, and the connection. We can inspect connection between industry and the Industrial Revolution, and how important industry is for the United States, and Gothic revival style. So this is another reason why we are invested in this particular inquiry and why we're talking about this now. So, okay, a little pause here. It's an interesting thing to say that to continue a bit further with the example of Art Deco, it's an interesting thing to say that we saw this style as very dashing, revolutionary, almost daring, optimistic. For all, we saw Art Deco as futuristic because it was invested mainly in skyscrapers. This is, of course, if we're talking about American Art Deco. If we're talking about the European Art Deco, the so-called heroic Art Deco, it's a completely different thing. And we may get to talk about it eventually. But American Art Deco, that is very much present in the skyscrapers, is a very futuristic, very optimistic, and very industrial style. And it really has a lot to do with optimism that is brought about with the Industrial Revolution. So I think it's fairly interesting, and it's a good reason for us to inquire into this, how a style that is all about the future, that is all about optimism, that the future will bring us many great things, is in fact rooted in a style that already existed, that already happened and ended centuries ago. So we can see on the example of Art Deco that there is a connection between the future that is being invoked and the past that is also being invoked. So we have a bridge connecting these two things. And normally we only think about Art Deco as futuristic because it has sharp lines, it has simplified surfaces, it's very clean, simplified, especially as compared to Art Nouveau, which is much more frilly and ornamental. But it's also situated at something that happened a long time ago. You could say the same thing about the Italian Renaissance, the example we started from, that it was seen as a revolution, a major innovation. It was very scandalous, it was very daring, it was a move away from medieval style that was in Western Europe mostly based in copying Byzantine style. And yes, it was very controversial and quite scandalous. But in itself, this style that was innovation, etc., innovation incarnate, was really hearkening back to something that happened 2,000 years ago. So I find this to be quite interesting, how here also, as is the case with Art Deco, here too we have this idea that future that was being invoked, something innovative, something revolutionary, something daring that was being done, was actually invoking times past all along. So we can see this interesting bridge between future, present, and past being made. So we need to address this. Obviously, this is a tendency that keeps happening, and it's something that keeps happening in many different instances. We're going to have 25 lectures. This is an introductory lecture. We're going to have 25 different ones that speak of these connections between different periods. So these are just the most obvious examples that I give in mode of introduction. Now, we need to ask ourselves why. If we go back to this premise of our time being linear, and if we go back to this idea that we go through constant development, why do then we keep going back to our past? Why do we keep invoking our past? You could say that it has a lot to do with us never truly cutting our ties with paganism. Yes. So we never truly stopped being pagan. This whole idea of cyclicality was always present in many different ways. Most of the culture we're talking about in this particular context is Christian and Abrahamic, but it shows us many different traits of paganism still being present. And it shows us a presence of this very interesting, very important aspect of paganism that is present in many different pagan cultures. The idea of the glorious past, the idea of the past that was much better than our present and is certainly much better than our future ever will be. So I think this particular idea is well presented in the mythical story, very famous Greek story that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, about different ages and the constant, non-interrupted, never-ending decadence with every new age. So in this particular worldview, we have the first golden age when everything was exceptional and perfect and amazing. We didn't have to work for nothing. We would basically just eat fruit that would fall into our mouths. We didn't even have to have hands to reach for the fruit. We were beautiful, we were strong, we were perfect. So this is the golden age. Then comes the silver age when people start spoiling. They're not really as perfect as their ancestors. It is basically the difference between gold and silver. Silver is still a noble metal, but it's not quite as valuable, nor is it quite as rare as gold. So after the Silver Age, we have the Bronze Age. After the Bronze Age, we have the Iron Age. You can see how, to a certain extent, this follows, if we're talking about the Bronze and the Iron Age, at least, the development of our technologies. So it's this idea that we have the Bronze Age first, then we have the Iron Age next, is that with the development of our technology, we become worse and worse. So this is not me saying this is the Greek myth, right, arguing the whole thing, is that with every sequent period, people are worse and worse. And in this particular instance, when, this myth is situated and when it was being told, we are in the worst of all eras. So the Iron Age is the worst of them all. And you can say that these people had the notion that everything was better before, and that their whole idea was that they pined after this paradise lost. Now, this takes us to yet another example, a very similar example, though told in different words, and this is the biblical example of the Garden of Eden. Now, this is probably something that we'll address a lot during the creation of our videos. I'm going to have a completely separate course of 54 lectures that is entirely dedicated to the Bible, because this is something that is very near and dear to me. I've spent a lot of time studying the Bible. I've spent a lot of time dealing with biblical exegesis. So for the moment, we're just going to briefly give an example of this whole notion of the Garden of Eden, creation of the first man and then a woman, that were perfect because they were divine creation, they were flawless, and they lived in perfect harmony. So the whole thing came to a halt, as we all know. We're all familiar with this story, when Eve and then Adam tasted the apple of forbidden knowledge, and they were cast out of Garden of Eden. So instead of just chilling and relaxing and existing in perfection as they did in the Garden of Eden, they had to work for their existence. So they had to till the soil, they had to know pain, shame, effort, all these other things. and humanity received a major setback, if you will. So you could see how, although these stories are quite different, the difference in ages as they happen and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, they do feature the same idea that back in the day it was much better than now, and that every sequent period is worse. Now, this is another thing that you can see in the Bible, in the Old Testament. If you follow the generations of people that were born after Adam and Eve, their children, their progeny, and then their children, you can see how they live shorter and shorter lives, how they have less and less of life to live. So first of these children live more than 1,000 years, then they live 900 years, then 800, 700, up until the moment where they start living under 100 years, which is something we can relate to. Let's say that it's not unheard of that someone lives to be 100. It's quite rare, but it's not quite as exceptional as someone living to be 1,000 years old. Well, we can agree that we don't know any such people. So we see that this is due to the level of evil that grows in the world. People live shorter and shorter lives because they are worse and worse. So even in the biblical context, in the context of Levant, we have this idea that we are constantly growing worse and worse as people, and that we are hearkening back nostalgically to this period of perfection, of bliss, of paradisical existence, really, quite literally, back before we were exiled from the Garden of Eden. You can connect these two notions with a very famous Freudian theory and a very famous Freudian essay that I recommend everybody reads. It's called Civilization and Its Discontents. It's available in the form of an audiobook right here on YouTube, if you prefer reading than listening. And what Freud basically argues in this essay, again very shortly, is that when we started fully being human properly, when we started developing settlements, and when we stopped sleeping on trees and in caves, when we started building villages and cities, we made a social contract of the sorts that we're going to be civilized, that we're going to be polite, that we are not going to listen to our base instincts. We are going to think about other people, not just ourselves. So the whole idea is that this decision made us stronger because we started living in larger communities where we could divide labor. It made us more safe. It made us able to plan better, but it has instilled a lot of frustrations, a lot of inhibitions into us because we were not able to listen to our base instincts. If we are to want something, if we are to covet something that our neighbor has, we have this internal voice saying, you cannot take this, it's not yours. So this frustrates us, and we are limited in every possible way. On daily basis, we have many different limitations. We do not want to pick our nose in public because it's seen as impolite. We do not want to, let's say, urinate or defecate in public because it's seen as impolite. So we have to suffer the pain of continence until we reach a place where we can safely do so. And these are just very banal examples of what Freud is talking about. The whole idea is that we sacrificed bliss and connection with nature. We sacrificed being one with nature for whatever civilization brought us. So comfort, safety, progress, these all came at a price. And the price are neuroses and hysterias and many other things that we suffer because we inhibit ourselves and because civilization, society as such, inhibits us. So this is the whole idea. And this would then explain to us why we would go back in our imagination, at least, or through arts, to the times past, and why we would want to revive and rehash these time past when everything was better than it is today. There is a very important thing to be said here. A very important part of our entire initiative is that when we are talking about this Freudian theory, and when we are talking about the biblical narrative of the Garden of Eden and the Golden Age in Greek myth, or the age story of Greek myth, we are really talking to a certain extent about development of humanity, backwards in a way. Because we are talking about it backwards, because we are now at the very last moment of development of humanity. So we are talking about what happened previously. We are unraveling the story a posteriori. So we are really talking about the moment when we started being human. And in another course that we are going to have, the history of art, through 54 or 52 different lectures, we're going to be talking about how history of art really followed development of humanity. And some of these early stages are really following evolutionary stages of humanity. We're going to go back to 3 million years before current moment. Then we're going to go back to 500,000 years before current moment, 250,000 years before current moment, 75,000 years before current moment, etc. So we're really going to be talking about not just history of art, but history of humanity, what we considered human. How can we call a certain animal human? What defines it as such? What separates it from nature? So this is all going to be a topic of our conversation. In this particular instance, it's important for us to understand that we are also engaged in these analogies, historical analogies between different periods, for this purpose too. Because if you're looking at history of humanity, truly you're looking, I mean, you can interpret it this way as well. You are looking at the history of separation of humans from other animals, and also separation of humans from nature as such. You need not look further than outside your window to see that this is true. We are building cities, we are building roads, we use these means of communications that are perfectly unnatural. There's nothing natural about talking into a camera surrounded by artificial lights, etc., instead of talking to another human being in person. So we are engaged in very unnatural lives, and the further and further we go in this direction, the further and further we go into development of technology and integration of technology into our daily lives, further and further we separate ourselves from nature. And this is something that Freud was arguing in his own Freudian way. This is something that the Greek myth is arguing with different ages that are connected to different metals. And this is also something that the biblical narrative was arguing with the Garden of Eden expulsion story. So we need to address these things that we mentioned as examples, because they are very good examples. So we can start with the Old Testament and the Bible in general, and we can say that I was taught when I went to school that European civilization has these two pillars, two foundations. And these two foundations, these two pillars are classical Greece on one end, or generally and Greek antiquity, Greco-Roman antiquity, if we're going to be generous. So this is the one pillar. The other pillar is the Bible. So one comes from Greece, the other comes from the Levant. More specifically, since I studied literature, the way this was represented to us, that we have the Iliad and the Odyssey on one end, and we have the Bible on the other. So Iliad and the Odyssey, the work of Homer, this is one pillar of European civilization. The Bible, that is the work of many different authors and many different time periods, is the other. Now, there is something that connects these two very profoundly. So we can say that the Bible on one end and Iliad and the Odyssey, the work of Homer, on the other, are seen as the very foundation of European culture. This means that in many different ways, these are at the very beginning of what we consider European culture. You could say that the Greeks measured their time from the first Olympic Games they had, which was in the 8th century BCE. This is the time when Homer lived. So he lived in 8th century BCE. And you could say that a lot of the Bible, if you're looking at the Old Testament, can be traced back to 1,000 years BCE, and then all up to the 1st century CE. This is when the Old Testament was fully compiled. Though you could argue that the Jewish people tend to see their history as spanning roughly 6,000 years old. This is what the Jewish calendar also says, that we are almost they count their time to be almost 6,000 years from current moment. So the whole idea is that we tend to see these as beginnings, and this could not be further from the truth. To a certain extent, yes, they are the beginning of European culture and everything that came after these incredibly important documents, but in another way, and this is really important, these are syntheses. These are not just the beginnings in terms of Bible fell from heaven and then we began our culture. Iliad and Odyssey dropped from heaven and Greeks began their civilization. No, these are both syntheses of already existing traditions, of already existing fragments that came from older civilizations. Now, when it comes to the Bible, we can trace Babylonian influences, we can trace Greek Hellenistic influences, Persian, of course Egyptian, perhaps the most important influence on the Bible, because the very idea of monotheism truly came from Egypt. They had the first monotheistic attempt created by the heretic pharaoh of Akhenaten. So we can see that the Bible really harkens back in itself, the Old Testament, that we call the Old Testament because it's old, harkens back to already existing times past. And not only that they are nostalgic about it through the whole idea of humanity being better, being more moral, more perfect than it is, but also in a very historical manner that we can literally trace influences of these cultures in the Bible itself. And we're going to talk about it when time comes. You could say the same thing about Homer and his work. Now, if we situate Homer at 8th century BCE, we can say that he is writing about, or singing rather, because a lot of this comes from oral tradition. He is singing about an event that happened in the 12th century BCE. We're talking about the Trojan War. And so he is basically singing about something that happened 4 centuries before he exists. And the way he sings about this is very important because he represents a civilization that is lost. He represents civilization that is no more. And he is basically representing it as the ideal. So if you know anything about the importance and presence of Homer in Greek literature, in Greek society, in Greek history, it was basically a foundational stone of their morals, of their mores. This was exemplary in every conceivable manner. And if you read Plato, you know that he had many issues with all of this. But the point is that Homer is talking about something, he's singing about something that happened 4 centuries before he even existed. And even more importantly, he is talking about something that happened in the pivotal historical time that is incredibly important and not nearly enough talked about, the historical period that we know as the Bronze Age collapse. So just one moment. Yeah, the moment that is known as the Bronze Age collapse. So this is basically the moment where entire society, not just society, rather societies of the old world collapsed, disappeared. So it was this cataclysmic event that wiped out entire civilizations, broke trade routes, broke exchange, communication, and really ushered in something that we know as the Greek Dark Age. Now, we no longer use this term for many different reasons, but I think it's an adequate descriptive term. So we had this period separating Homer from the events that he is describing that is known as the Greek Dark Age. So 4 centuries of relative cultural stagnation. Now, this is, of course, very comparable to the period that we know happens after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the early medieval period that is also descriptively and very inaccurately known as the Dark Ages. So you could argue that it's inaccurate for very similar reasons of why the Greek Dark Age is an inaccurate description. But the point is that there's a very strong similarity between these two. And that whatever happens in the medieval period that we're going to be addressing when we start talking about Romanesque style basically happens in a very similar manner to how Homer sings about something that happened 4 centuries before he even existed. So he is singing about great heroes of yore that are no longer here. He is singing about a magical world where gods coexist with heroes. They coexist with humans. So in this particular magical world, it's nothing strange to see a god walking amongst humans. It's not a surprise to anyone that gods partake in the battle between the Trojans and the Achaeans. Certain gods go with Trojans, certain gods go with Achaeans. So these people are not fazed by it. I would argue that we today would be quite surprised to see God or gods come from heaven and start doing things just out of the bloom. But he is singing about, again, a better world, a world of greater heroes, the world of greater heroics, greater exploits, and the world that we need to see in every conceivable way as exemplary, the world that we need to look to and model our entire behavior in regards to it. So you could argue that the Bible is very much the same in the Christian, but also in Islamic world. The Bible, and then for Islam's the Quran, of course, is seen as the model of behavior. This is the foundation of the entire Christian morals. This is how you should behave. And this is something that is very contemporary. It doesn't matter that it speaks about events that took place 3,000 years ago or even more. It doesn't matter that it goes back to the very foundation of the universe, as the book of Genesis does. All the more, actually, that it goes back to such profound ancient history, all the more we should pay attention to it, and we should model ourselves in regards to this example. So you could see this with the Greeks when it comes to the mythical Golden Age. You can see this with Greeks when they're talking about something that actually happened. Many historians agree that Trojan War did happen one way or the other. Schliemann was inspired famously by the Iliad and the Odyssey. He retraced what was described in Iliad and Odyssey, so he went to this location where he assumed he was going to found Troy, and he did. He found it. It was there. So this is a very interesting story. The whole point is that even if we're talking about myth or we're talking about history, there is this very important tendency that we have to go and look to the past, and to look to the past for guidance, to seek guidance, wisdom, and examples of how we should act today and in the future, and to do that following the examples from the past. Now, you could go forth with this whole example that is given to us by the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you can see what happened with Virgil, a Roman poet, when he created the Aeneid. So he basically wanted the same thing as the Iliad and the Odyssey, but in Roman context. And so he creates this epic that half of it emulates Iliad, half of it emulates the Odyssey. He flips it. First goes the Odyssey, then goes the Iliad part. So he basically wants to appropriate the foundational narrative of the Greek civilization, and he wants to make it Roman. So he follows the example of Homer, very obviously, and this was not a secret to anyone because Homer was very popular in Rome too, and he creates a Roman version of Iliad and Odyssey brought together that is known as the Aeneid. And this is, of course, an incredibly political act. A lot can be said about it. It's very proto-nationalistic. He is doing this to legitimize in a cultural manner the rule of Octavian Augustus, and to write the work of literature, a work of fiction that is prophetic, but is a posteriori prophetic because he situates it in the very distant time of foundation of Rome. Christian, but I would rather argue Catholic theologists see the mention of Christ even before Christianity, see rather anticipation of Christ in the Aeneid and in other works of Virgil. So the whole idea with this is that we have an intentional rehashing of work of literature that separates Virgil from Homer. You could say that there is a good 7 centuries of difference between the two. So he is hearkening back to something that was created much before his time, knowing full well that Homer was also writing about something that happened much before his time, and that Homer was talking about a civilization that was no more. Possibly, if we were to find examples of literature that did came from these societies before the Bronze Age collapsed, they would tell us the very same thing. They would also hearken back to some other times that were much better than their own. So this is a general tendency that we are expecting here. So I think this is quite interesting if we are to situate this tendency in our general history, and if we're going to stick with the Greek example to address the fact that Greeks indeed had some phenomenal technology around. They just didn't bother to develop it or to use it quite as much as we did. So you could argue that the Greeks already had a battery. This is more or less a well-known fact, that certain Greek temples had automata, meaning that had mechanical animals that were able to move and mimic behavior of animals that were entirely artificially made. So this is all surprising if we're thinking about the general level of technology available to the Greeks. Now, why am I talking about this? I think technology has a lot to do with this idea of us going from one period to the other, and every other period, every newer period being worse than the previous. I think it has a lot to do with development of tools. You could argue that tools and the usage of tools is really what primarily separates us from the animal world. If you're looking at history of humanity, deep, profound history of humanity that goes back millions of years, you are really looking at tools and how our tools became more and more complex, and how we've changed in regards to the tools we were able to create and then use. So the very important part of this entire inquiry is relationship with technology. The very important part of it is the way that we talk about the Industrial Revolution, and before that, the Agricultural Revolution. So we cannot really separate technology from these mythical stories, be they Greek or be they Levantine. So there is something to be said. And I think it's an interesting thing to address here when we speak of technology, that we did have some amazing innovations, some amazing discoveries that we completely failed to use, like is the case with Greek batteries that they had way back in the day. we did have this very important development, these life-changing and history-changing events, like the invention of the wheel. We don't need to elaborate on that. It's very clear, like invention and usage, not really invention, but usage of fire. We'll be talking about this a lot in other courses. So we had these incredible changes in our history, in our society, but on the other end, we had some things that pretty much always stay the same. So if you think about Egypt and you think about usage of everyday objects, they pretty much had the same stuff as we did. Now, you can go to the Louvre Museum in Paris and you can visit their Egyptian section. So they have this entire part of their Egyptian section that is dedicated to furniture. And you go there and you see, let's say, a bed, a nightstand, a broom, a table, a chair, and you see that they look exactly the same as they do today. So not much innovation has been done to the chair from the times of Egypt to today. So this particular exhibition, this particular section of the Egyptian collection goes back to, I'd say, 15th century BCE. So this is something that is 3,600 years old, and literally you can see the chair that looks 100% exactly the same as any chair does today. The same is true with their mirrors. The only difference would be that they made their mirrors out of bronze, highly polished bronze and other metals. They didn't have glass. The same is true with musical instruments, with dental instruments. Most of these were invented by the Egyptians, and they did not really change that much. The little mirror that dentists use, that scraping thing, that very annoying thing that dentists have, that was also used by the Egyptians. So on one end, we have this incredible march and development of technology that changes everything, not to talk about the internet or planes or electricity. On the other end, we have some things that stay the same, and that are very likely to stay the same. I don't think that, let's say, 100 or 500 or 1,000 years from now, chairs will drastically change. I think that the table is going to stay the same. A cup, a bowl, a plate, a fork. I mean, these things are probably going to stay pretty much the same as they are today. So this creates a certain dynamism or a certain friction, if you will, that we do have drastic development in terms of technology and also in terms of culture, but then we have things that are exactly the same as they were thousands of years ago, and we have this tendency to keep going back to the past. So this creates a lot of friction, and this creates a situation that was well described by a person whose name I can't remember now, so I'll just quote them, not being able to remember their name, that the whole issue with humanity, the whole problem with humanity is that we have prehistoric bodies that did not change from prehistory to today. Let's say at least in the previous 300,000 years, we have exactly the same bodies. We have medieval institutions, and we have futuristic space age technology. So we are entirely stuck in between these different realms, different temporal realms that have to coexist, that we have to coexist in. And I think this is very true. I think this is a very accurate definition. So one of the reasons why we are doing what we are doing here, why we are opening an entire course where we are looking at historical analogies, is to address this fact that we coexist in different temporal realms just by being around in present day. Now, you have this entire dynamics within this conundrum, within this complex situation that assumes a very particular shape. And the shape in question is that we have something that is old, that is very long, and filled with substance, filled with divinity, in most cases filled with sacred, and filled with magic. And we have the new that is much shorter, and is actually quite banal, and is quite down to earth, and has no magic, has no divinity, doesn't really have sacred, not nearly as much as it does in the old. So you could argue that we always feel that our current period is kind of lame, not terribly interesting, but if we go back and look to our glorious past, it doesn't happen. It doesn't matter if this glorious past is 100 years in the past, or 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, or millions of years, literally. So past is always better, and past is always longer, and more pregnant with meaning and with substance, whereas the present is always banal. So I can go back to the example again, biblical example of Old and the New Testament. If you're to look the Old and the New Testament physically, you don't even have to read them. You can just look at the books rather, and you can see that the Old Testament is much longer than the New. So it really depends on different Bibles, because Orthodox and Catholic and Protestant Bibles are not entirely the same. They don't include the same books. But in all of these instances, Old Testament is much larger, roughly 3.5 times larger than the New Testament. So you have this situation that the New Testament really builds on top of an already existing entity, and it builds in a smaller manner. The contribution is not quite as large. I mean, I'm talking about just the physical number of page and the quantity of books. I'm not talking about importance, obviously. So you could argue that God is much more present as a physical entity in the Old Testament than he is in the New. New Testament in this regard is actually quite historical. We have, behavior of Jesus. We have letters written by Paul. We are addressing a period in history that we know existed. This is the Roman occupation of Levant. So this really happened. We have many different historical sources about this, whereas the Old Testament has a lot more mythical elements, like the creation of the world, like the Great Flood, like all of these other things. So the Great Flood would be a good example of presence of previous narratives that are to be found in the Old Testament. We know that the narrative of the flood is present in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that goes way back into the past, that is much older than the Old Testament. So this whole idea is that the New Testament builds on top of an already existing notion. So you can compare this in its own right with what Virgil is doing with Homer. You can compare this with what Renaissance is doing with classical Greece, with what Gothic revival and then Art Deco as a branch of Gothic revival is doing with Gothic period. So we are always addressing something that already happened long ago, that was much longer, that was more pregnant with meaning, that was original. And this is the tendency we have in all of our cultures. This is not just reserved to our, you could argue, Western European or transatlantic Christian, etc. culture, or Abrahamic rather than Christian. So this is something that existed in the old world. So you could argue that Sumerian civilization was older than Egyptian, was older than Babylonian. And Egyptian people felt that Sumerian civilization was more pregnant with meaning, was more filled with substance than their own. They believed, for example, and I find this incredibly interesting as philologist, that Sumerian language was pure magic, that it was incredibly powerful, that if you were to speak in Sumerian language, that whatever you mention would instantly materialize. So, you know, when they said you should not speak evil, or you should not curse, or you should not invoke evil forces, etc., we feel as if language has a certain power, and we feel that if we talk about something, it will likely happen. I think nowadays it's popular to talk about manifesting things. So you could say that Egyptians brought this to a completely different level by saying that Sumerian language was this powerful, this pure, like the original human, proto-human language, that anything you would say would instantly happen, materialize. So this is next level, ultimate level magic, if you will. So it's something that we need to address, that we feel as humans that we have this dynamic that whatever was in our distant past was true, was original, was fundamental in many ways, and what happens in our present is lame, not as interesting, is but a copy of whatever happened previously. Now, there's another very important reason for us to address all of this and to create this entire course, and this is to address the fact that the further we go back into the past, the less we know of it. And this is actually quite clear to understand. We don't really have to explain it any further. So the further we go to the past, less documents we have. We only truly started fully documenting, more or less, whatever happens with the Industrial Revolution and with the 19th century. So if you go back to the 18th century, it's not as well documented as the 19th. If you go back to the 17th, it's not as well documented as the 18th. And you get the point. Now, we do have certain gaps in history that are less documented than some of the previous eras. Like, we could argue that the pinnacle of the Roman Empire is better documented than the European Dark Ages. So there's also that. But generally, the more we go into history, not to even speak of prehistory, not to even speak of times before we had writing, lesser and lesser artifacts, documents, etc. we do have. So we have to invest a certain effort into recreating these past times. What happens then? We have this tendency to always go back to the past, and we have this generally European attitude, but I would say it really is larger than European, that the older something is, the better it is, more original, more fundamental it is. So we have this whole idea that our roots are lost in time and are they're difficult to retrieve, if not impossible to retrieve and comprehend. So what we do is then we constantly rehash our past and we bring it forward. So we reactualize it, we revive it. Again, we go back to the idea of the Renaissance, the rebirth. So past is constantly being reborn in newer and newer eras, in newer and newer styles. So the reason why we do this is exactly because we don't have a lot of past around. We don't have a lot of it, so we try to imagine it. We try to recreate these massive lacunas. So I think it's good for us to take an example of the puzzle so as to be able to understand this. Now, we can think about different, not only historical styles or stylistic formations from history of art, we're talking about entire eras. So we could say that if we look at an era as a puzzle set that has, let's say, 1,000 pieces, we can say that we've had 100 eras from beginning of humanity to today. Now, this is an entirely arbitrary number. I don't know how many eras we had. I don't think it's possible to define it as such. I just gave a number for comparison and for purposes of this. So I just gave a random number. So anyhow, let's say that we have an entire era being represented as a puzzle with 1,000 pieces. And in many cases, we would not have 1,000 pieces. We would have some pieces lacking. So we have empty spaces in this puzzle of ours. And the further we go back into the past, fewer pieces we have. So let's say that out of a puzzle piece that has 1,000 pieces, we would only have 2 or 3. And some of these eras, some of these periods are so scarcely documented that we would not even have a single puzzle piece. So this is a really big problem, because we have this notion, or we have a tendency rather, that we want to fully understand whatever we are dealing with. If we want to inspect and learn from our past, we want to have as much info as possible. We want to be able to have all of the info so that we can fully recreate this particular period we are talking about, we are inquiring into. So what we then do is that we invent, we get creative. We basically recreate these missing pieces from our own contemporary perspectives. And this is partially what the Renaissance people were trying to do when they were emulating classical Greece. They were trying to recreate so as to better understand. You could argue that this is what Virgil was doing with Homer, although, of course, he had a very strict and very strong political goal behind this. Doesn't really matter. But he was trying to bring forth this age of lost heroes, appropriate it, make it Roman, but not only for opportunistic political purposes, but also so as to better understand it, so as to truly bring it back and bring it forth. So if you think about this entire affair of reactualizing past, this is something that is present throughout the whole of history of art. We almost have no invention that would not be a rehashing of an already existing era. And this is something that we aim to address in this particular course. Now, again, all of this is but an introduction. So what we are talking about really is the tendency to continually bring past back so as to recreate it and so as to complete it, so as to make it holier, to make it more whole. And then we can say that dealing with history, not just history of art, but also history in this particular manner, is a creative act, because we are recreating a lot, we are inventing a lot. And this can be as dangerous and treacherous as it is interesting and inspiring. So with this, I would like to conclude this introductory course. The next thing we're going to talk about is going to be Romanesque art and neoclassical art, and how these two eras communicate in a way that we explained now. I hope you will find this interesting. I hope you have enjoyed this, and I hope to see you again very soon. Ciao.